So today we are looking at the cardiac cycle. So a little bit then about how it works, sort of a general overview, and then we're going to get to grips with the Wiggers diagram, because this is the diagram that causes so many headaches. But if you get the trick of what's going on, then it's really more straightforward. I wouldn't say it's easy, it is a challenge, but if you can start to see the features, then it is a logical diagram that does make sense. And it's an important one to know, because those diagrams of that cardiac cycle are things they like to put in multiple choice questions. So let's just start off now with an overview of cardiac cycle. It will help if my pen is actually plugged into my computer. Okay. Right, we have connection. So the cardiac cycle, remember, it's going over and over and over again. So there's no start and no end, because it repeats. So we generally take the start as the initiation of that electrical impulse that then coordinates one heartbeat. So if we think now of a beautiful drawing of a heart, okay? So at the top you have your atria. Okay, remember, your left and your right go back to front on a heart. So left is on that side, right is on that side, because it's as if you are looking at a person. So at the bottom, in the pointy bit, we have the ventricles. So the left ventricle on this side, and the right ventricle on that side. Down the middle, we're just going to widen this a little bit, because here's our septum. And then also we would want to indicate that the left side of the heart has thicker muscle. So all of this is important background in order to understand that cardiac cycle. You've got to have a good understanding of the heart structure itself. Other things to remember is you've got valves, your atrioventricular valves between your atria and your ventricles, and then we leave the heart via the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Okay, so your aorta comes from your left ventricle, and your pulmonary artery from your right ventricle. So this is our basic but rather descriptive diagram of our heart. So one cardiac cycle, one heartbeat. How does it actually happen? Now we need a different color because we've got so much scribbled in red. So at the top here, we have what is called the sinoatrial node, okay? Also abbreviated as the SAN. Okay, and this is a piece of muscle cells, a piece of tissue, okay? And these cells contract slightly faster than the rest of the cells in the heart. And what it does is that they set the rhythm for the whole heart. This is where it all starts. Okay, so when they contract, they send out an electrical impulse, and that impulse then spreads across the atria. So the atria contract first. So sinoatrial node sets the rhythm, and then the atrial walls contract. Now, we've got a massive difference in muscle quantity between the atrial walls and the ventricular walls. So we must also bear that in mind. Atrial walls are so thin, you almost think, can that even be muscle? But it is muscle, and it does contract. Your ventricle walls are much thicker. You can see, no, that's definitely muscle. Okay, so they then create a lot more pressure. Okay, so atrial walls contract, it's a little bit of pressure, and our blood goes from the atrium down into the ventricle. But remember now how we drew this. We drew this line for aorta coming up from the left ventricle, and the pulmonary artery comes up from the right ventricle. So we've got to squeeze up from the bottom. But we've got this problem that our electrical impulse starts at the top. How do we get around that? We have, in the middle here, the Atrioventricular Node. also called the AVN for short. So he sits between the atria and the ventricles. And what happens is, as this impulse passes over the atria, it can't go straight down into the ventricles. The only way that it can get through is at the AVN. So we have control. Our atria contract, and then we get to the AVN. What the AVN does is it also pauses the impulse slightly, because we don't want the atria and the ventricles to contract at the same time. Because remember, we want the blood to go from the atria to the ventricles and out. Okay, so things have to happen in a sequence. So this delays the impulse by about 0.1 seconds. It's not very long at all. Okay, then we travel down the Purkinje tissue, which is down the middle of the septum. So the Purkinje tissue made up of conducting fibers that run down the center there. They take that impulse all the way to the base of the heart. Okay, to the very, very bottom of the ventricles. And then we can get into the ventricle wall, and of course we will then contract from the bottom of the heart, which is going to then squeeze the blood up. So let's find another color. Let's go blue because we're doing electrical impulse again. So we now spread out round the walls of the ventricle. And this makes the ventricle walls contract. And that is one major big squeeze, okay? Because we've got a lot more muscle in our ventricles than we do in our atria. So this is a big squeeze, and it gets the blood all the way up and into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So also because we've got more muscle on the left-hand side, we're going into the aorta around the whole body, so we need a higher pressure. So more muscle, even bigger squeeze in the left ventricle than in the right. So what happens next? Everybody relaxes and we start again. So ventricle walls relax and the SAN initiates. Okay, so then we start that cycle all over again, and it's continuous and it's repetitive and it keeps going. Okay, and that's our heartbeat. So it's quite important that you've got this sort of understanding of what the cardiac cycle is and this difference in structure between different parts of the heart, so that we can then look at this diagram and understand it a bit better. So are we happy with the cardiac cycle in terms of where things are happening and the order in which things happen? Okay, cool. So this is one heartbeat, okay, in order to get everything out. It's one lub-dub. Okay, so now we're going to get into the details of where that lub-dub comes from and all the other bits and pieces that are happening. In order to do so, we're going to switch to a PDF because I'm not drawing this diagram. So here we have a pre-made diagram from Wikimedia Commons, and we are working then on understanding what each of these lines mean and how they tie together. Okay, so we're going to actually start with the electrocardiogram, because that is the one that we've just been talking about, how the electrical impulse moves across the heart. And we've got 3 zones that we're going to look at. So if we look down here at the bottom, they actually even label it for us, the PQRST. That's one zone is our P zone. The next zone is our QRS. And then the third one is our T. Now, what is happening where? At P, so this first little bump, this is our impulse through our atrial walls. Okay, so this is now our atrial systole, where we're going across the atrial walls and we are initiating that contraction. QRS, this is now, we've got down to the ventricles and we're squeezing for those ventricles. So you can see here the delay caused by the Burkiani tissue, right in there where the arrow is. And then we have our ventricular walls. Okay, so this is now that excitation across the ventricular walls. It causes them to contract. And then the last bit, this sort of longer small bump, this is now our ventricular recovery. My pen does not want to write small today. It's going to have to get used to it because we've got a lot of writing to put onto this. Okay, so electrocardiogram. We can see the atrial walls, we can see the ventricular walls, we can see the ventricular recovery. And then it all starts again. So if we go to this piece here that's not labeled, there's our atrial walls, our ventricular walls, our ventricular recovery, over and over again. So now then, let's look at this. How does this now work on the pressure, for example? So we shall start with the atrial pressure. So let's go for gray for the atrial pressure. Okay, so atrial pressure is this line here, second one from the top. And it's this gray line that sort of wobbles not much. Remember we said the atria have a very thin muscular wall. So there's not going to be so much of an impact. Also, a lot of the blood, when it enters the heart into the atria, it trickles through into the ventricles. So it doesn't fill up and squeeze like the ventricle does. Okay, so if we start here at the beginning, see how we have this wave of excitation over the atrial walls, and then we have an increase in pressure. Isn't that fantastic? Because what that is, that's showing us our atrial systole, when our atria are contracting. Now they tell us here, mitral valve closes. We're going to come to that when we talk about the ventricular pressure. Okay, so atrial systole, then the atrium, your pressure decreases, it increases a little bit here. We'll link that to the ventricle as well. And then it comes up, and then pressure builds in the atrium a little bit, and then we have a valve opening, and then it goes down a bit, and then it's atrial systole again. Okay, so we don't have all that much change in our atrial pressure. The fun bit is this atrial systole bit, and then this wobbly bit. So if we change now to looking at the ventricular pressure in blue. So ventricular pressure is roughly the same. Then all of a sudden it massively increases. Okay, and that coincides with your electrical impulse ventricular walls. So here we have our ventricular systole. Okay, so what happens and why does that mitral valve close? Well, this mitral valve, you probably know as the atrioventricular valve. That's the terminology we tend to use, but it's also known as the mitral valve. Okay, so atrioventricular valve closes. That is the valve, remember, between the atrium and the ventricle. So as that ventricle starts to squeeze, that valve has to close because otherwise all the blood is just going to go back into the atrium, and we don't want that. We want it to go into the arteries that are leaving the heart. So the atrioventricular valve closes, and that pressure then ramps up in the ventricles as they squeeze. Okay, we get to this point here, and our aortic valve opens. Okay, now we've got enough pressure to force the blood into the aorta. So on the other side, we would have a similar thing, though at lower pressure for the pulmonary artery. Okay, we'll do aortic valves when we look at the aorta. Okay, so we're squeezing that blood out, and we get to the point now where the pressure starts to decrease. So we've squeezed the blood out. The pressure then is decreasing because we're not squeezing against anything. We start to relax, and our pressure drops. When we get down to this drop of pressure, and we have the similar pressure to the atrium, then the mitral valve, the atrioventricular valve, opens. So again, we can steadily fill our ventricles with blood. As the ventricles fill with blood, there's a little bit of an increase in pressure because it's trickling through. Okay, so the blood is trickling through in here, and it goes up a little bit, but it's only really when we squeeze and when we close that valve that the pressure then shoots up again in the ventricle. Are we happy now with the atrial and the ventricular pressure? All related to that, muscle squeeze. So let's think now how that relates to aortic pressure and ventricular volume. So we've already used gray, so aortic pressure can go in black. So the aorta and to then the pulmonary artery will be the same, just at a lower pressure because it's on the right side of the heart. It's not as such high pressure. Aortic pressure is going to respond to that ventricular pressure because that's what's sending the blood in. Okay, remember your aorta is an artery. It's going to stretch. It's got lots of muscles going on. Okay, so it sits there and it waits. And now we get ventricular systole. Okay, ventricular systole happens and as pressure ramps up, the aortic valve opens and now we get blood rushing into the aorta, so our pressure increases. Okay, then of course, remember how things start relaxing, so we've got to come down again, but we don't want that blood just to rush back down into the ventricle because remember we're pushing from the ventricle up into the aorta. So if we didn't stop that blood coming back, it would just all run back down. It's got to send on its way. And that's what happens here with this fun little blip, okay, is that we close that valve. The valve closes right here. The aortic valve closes, it stops the backflow. Okay, and if you think of it, if you've got blood that's trying to get back and now that valve stops it, it sort of goes boom. And then it goes on where it needs to go. And that's why we get that little bump and then aortic pressure drops because the blood now is going to continue on to wherever it needs to go, all around the whole entire body other than the lungs because your pulmonary artery is going to the lungs. So then we go along and we drop pressure until that ventricular pressure is so much that we open that aortic valve again. Aorta builds pressure, it drops with the ventricle until the valve closes, and then it sends the blood on again. So how does this also then relate to volume? Okay, so a lot of this pressure change is linked into volume because it's the volume of the blood. Okay, so ventricular volume is the one we're going to look at on this diagram. So if we look at it, our ventricular volume, remember we said that in this section here, the blood is slowly trickling in. So we've opened, we'll start from this section here. We've opened our mitral valve. We've opened our atrioventricular valve. Okay, so atrioventricular valve opens and then blood can trickle in. So it's not squeezing in from the atrium. It's just trickling in slowly because it's gravity. So we come in from a vein into the atrium and we trickle through that open atrioventricular valve into the ventricle. So the volume goes up and then it slowly goes up. And then see here we have another little lumpy bit. And look how it lines up with that atrial pressure. So when the atria squeeze, now our ventricles reach their maximum volume. Okay, then our ventricles start squeezing. And you see here the beginning of the squeeze before the aortic valve opens, then our ventricle volume stays the same because the blood hasn't gone anywhere. We're just building this pressure from the muscles squeezing. As soon as that aortic valve opens, then the ventricle volume drops dramatically because here we are squeezing all that blood out. Then once we get to a point of our aortic valve closing, see here now we're at that constant volume of low volume, mitral valve opens, and we up again. So what you want to do whenever you have a diagram like this, you want to plan out those, okay, where's my valve openings? Where's my valves closing? Which valve is opening? Which valve is closing? And how does this then link around into what's happening with my volume? And how does my volume link to my pressure? So there is one more piece on this, and that is your phonocardiogram. Seeing as he has gray again, let's be a little bit more colorful. We'll do him in green instead. Okay, so your phonocardiogram is down here at the bottom. So cardiogram, we're measuring things with the heart. Phono, we're measuring sound. So this is your lub-dub. And what causes your lub-dub is actually your valves closing. So if you look at your lubs and your dubs, so we want to go through one entire cardiac cycle here. So let's look at one entire cycle, one entire heartbeat here. So here is one, and here is our second. And this first one comes in time with our atrioventricular valve closing. So it's the sound that's made as that blood pushes back against that valve, fills up the valve, and therefore closes it, so that we don't have that connection between the atria and the ventricles anymore. So this here is your atrioventricular valves closing. And if we look here at the second one, the dub, then he lines up quite nicely with your aortic valve closing. So the dub is stopping that backflow in the aorta, stopping that blood from just running straight back into the ventricle, in the left ventricle, and then the right side, it's that stopping the backflow of the pulmonary artery into the right ventricle. So this one here is where we're going to, if we can spell it right, close the aortic valve. So that then links in with the sound as well. So we've got everything here from our electrical impulse in our electrocardiogram through an understanding of how the pressures interrelate to each other, how that links to volume, and what sounds it makes. So that's why these diagrams are so wonderful, actually, in a way. Yes, they might look like a lot of lines and a lot of things going on, but they enable you to get an idea of a simultaneous understanding of all the different pieces that are involved in the cardiac cycle, all the different pieces that are involved in the control of the cycle through the electrocardiogram, and then the movement of the blood from the atria to the ventricles, and from the ventricles into the aorta. So it's really a fantastic overview of understanding the cardiac cycle and understanding the heartbeat. So it's well worth spending the time getting to know these diagrams and getting familiar with what you're looking at. Then when you take this into a question in a paper, then you've got the time and you've got the background, the time you've put in, the background to understanding these diagrams that you can then take further into understanding the question and looking at which piece of the diagram have they given you to work with, and therefore how are you going to sort out your answers.